Do you have investment properties you're considering selling and would like to learn how to defer the tax consequences? Then you need to call Equity Advantage and learn about a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange is a powerful investment tool. It enables you to keep a property's equity intact when it's used to acquire like-kind replacement property of equal or greater value and equity, even if you recently acquired the property. For over 30 years, Equity Advantage has been providing investors solutions for deferring taxes and maximizing the value of investments through a 1031 exchange. At Equity Advantage, we don't sell investments, but rather provide the tax deferment tools and expertise to facilitate their sale and transfer. Learn more by going to 1031exchange.com. or Google YouTube Equity Advantage for in-depth videos. Listen, you've worked hard for the money in your investments. Equity Advantage works hard to keep it yours.
Learn more about 1031 exchanges and Equity Advantage at 1031exchange.com. That's 1031exchange.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and should we be spending another $2 billion off to Ukraine? I'm going to give you the details on this latest aid package, but the Department of Defense announced, and it was late on Friday, they plan to announce things on Friday in government, and usually the story disappears over the weekend. $2.1 billion. Now, I know that some of you believe we should just shovel out money for Ukraine until, well, whenever it's over, with nobody having any idea when it's going to end or whether or not there are any realistic negotiations to bring it to an end. But in the meantime, the American public should simply shovel out the money, shovel out the ammunition, provide them with whatever they need, and put ourselves right on the edge of a possible conflict with Russia, which is, I might remind you, another nuclear-armed superpower. Welcome to the Lars Larson Show on a Monday. If you want to jump into the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Coming up this hour, let me give you an idea of what the plan is for this hour. Should taxpayers fund the cost of a surrogate mother for gay dads who cannot produce a child themselves? I would say no to that idea. I might get a naysayer who says yes, and I'd be glad to take that naysayer call if you can explain to me. I understand, because I had the talk when I was a kid. I understand that two men cannot produce a child. I understand that it's become fashionable lately for some people, both heterosexual couples and gay couples, to produce children, and they hire a young lady to do it so that mom doesn't have to show the bulge that you get from being pregnant. Most of the women I've known who've had children were happy to look that way, but apparently it's fashionable to do it otherwise. But now we've got two gay dads who are saying, we want to produce a child, we can't do it on our own, and we don't want to pay the bill. We think the rest of the taxpayers should pay for that surrogate mom for the gay dads who cannot produce a child on their own. I'll give you my opinion, but you might have guessed it already. Joe Biden says he's seen an imminent thaw in relations with China, but are his actions actually causing a permanent freeze instead? And is he, as I have suspected since the very beginning, is Joe Biden already bought and paid for by Beijing? If he sees a thaw, I have a feeling the Biden crime family sees some money to be made in Beijing, China, and Joe Biden is going to make it happen. I mean, as though he's not already shoveling enough of our money off to communist China as it stands. I mean, we're shutting down coal-fired electric plants in America while China is building coal-fired electric plants there so they can make the solar panels and the batteries and the battery-powered cars that Joe Biden wants to force Americans to buy, and he wants to force the American taxpayers to subsidize them. If he sees a thaw, I think it's because he sees some green in China, and it's not for you and me. It's for him and other members of the Biden crime family. According to a brand new report, the nation's largest Catholic healthcare system now performs transgender surgeries. Is nothing sacred anymore? And do those Catholic healthcare systems believe that we're made in God's image? And in which case, should you really be taking a knife to what is made by God? And take just a moment to cast a vote in my Twitter poll. You'll find the question every day at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. And listen closely. Should foster parents lose their children if they refuse to endorse transgender education of those children. I suspect this is happening in places in America. We'll bring it to your attention when we become aware of that. But this report comes out of Great Britain. In the United Kingdom, the deputy head teacher at one school reported a foster mother to the authorities after the woman questioned the school's teaching of gender ideology. According to the London Telegraph, the official claims that the woman, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was exposing the children to exceptionally bigoted views. That's a quote. The children were looked after well physically, but they might expound similar bigoted views as the mother. In other words, the mother was probably teaching the kids a boy cannot become a girl, and a girl cannot become a boy, and it doesn't matter what you think you are. You were born with either XY or Y chromosomes. The woman said, "I'm very concerned about the environment these girls are growing up in. If the views she gives in her email and the views she is giving at home, the girls are well presented, well fed, looked after physically, and loved. But how are they going to grow up in terms of their views if those views are the ones they're hearing from their carer?" In other words, not their mother, not their father. We're changing to a gender-neutral term called carer. Well, other people may be. I'm not. But should a foster parent lose her children if she won't endorse transgender indoctrination of those kids? I would say no. They shouldn't lose their kids, but you can answer the Twitter poll any way you like. At Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Always brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group a long time ago. You should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, on Friday's Twitter poll on First Amendment Friday, because we knew that the indictment had come down, and in fact, Donald Trump will be showing up in court in Florida tomorrow, does the indictment of President Trump change your vote in 2024? Now, I said no to that question. And so did 94% of you. Only 6% of you said yes, that would change the vote that you cast in the 2024 election. Now, I don't think that makes any sense. President Trump is the same man he's always been. And in this case, you've got a very political prosecution of Donald Trump. It's clearly aimed at Trump because Joe Biden and the Democrats understand that's the only way they're going to hang on to the election. The only way they're going to hold the presidency is if they indict and convict Donald Trump. And he says even if he is indicted or convicted, he's still going to run for president. And I'll tell you this, based on the polls, he's still going to win. If you're buying that name brand CBD right now, you should write down this website. It's genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. Make the switch to generic CBD and save today. And save big time, up to 75%. Their products are fantastic. They also sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. My wife and I love it. It retails for $100. It's on sale right now for $39.95. But you can try it out for free. That's right. Just pay $2.95 for the shipping. This penetrating cream melts right into your muscles and joints, including your knees, your elbow, and your lower back. You won't believe how fast it goes to work. Plus, it doubles as one of the best moisturizers you've ever tried. Try it out for yourself. You'll love it. Get your free sample headed your way right now at genericcbd.com. See what this amazing generic CBD cream can do for you. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. Glad to be with you on a Monday. Coming up in just a moment, we got to talk about China and about what China has been doing to be provocative toward the rest of the world. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday, and Rebecca Heinrichs is with me from the Hudson Institute. Rebecca, welcome to the program. You got to tell me this. China's out there. In a month alone, they have harassed and threatened a U.S. fighter jet and a naval ship. They're taking all kinds of aggressive actions. And yet Joe Biden says, hey, I kind of sense there's a thaw in our relationship with the Chinese communists. Does any of that make sense to you?
No, it doesn't make any sense. And I would say that it's not just that the Chinese military is behaving provocatively. It's not just that they're harassing it's aircraft and it's sea craft flying and sailing in international waters lawfully, but they are behaving dangerously, getting very close to American flagged ships and also ally flagged ships, to the point where we have to move out of the way, otherwise there's going to be a collision. That kind of behavior is getting worse. It's not getting better. And yet President Biden really wants this kind of reset, a thaw with the Chinese. So he is trying to keep this kind of thing out of the news.
Well, and for example, if he got the thaw, I don't see why he sees a thaw coming, but all right, he claims that's coming. So we got a thaw with China, the same way that Obama and Hillary Clinton wanted a reset with Russia. And then in a short period of time, China decides we're going to take Taiwan. It's a great opportunity. We're on good terms with the U.S., and they won't say anything. I mean, the Russians under Obama and Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, they were doing their best to try to open things up. Tell Comrade Vladimir, I'll have more flexibility after the election. And now they're the bad guys. So help me unsort that, please.
Well, there's only a couple of tricks whenever it comes to, these are progressive national security people. So they believe that they have this way of going about foreign policy where, if it's the United States that's being overly strong, or if the United States is doing things that, yes, we think it's right, but it bothers the Russians, it bothers the Chinese, maybe we just don't talk about it. Maybe we stop doing it. Maybe we're the problem. Of course, this is erroneous. It's totally wrong. But this is something that the Obama administration tried, as you point out, with Russia Reset. And then now they're doing it with the Biden administration is trying it with China. And as you rightly point out, both the Russians and the Chinese look at this and they say, oh, if the Americans aren't going to call us out, make us pay a price, why would we stop? In fact, you see that it actually makes them even bolder because they haven't been pushed back, so they're going to continue to accelerate this very dangerous, provocative, and reckless behavior.
Well, and can you identify, is this really Joe Biden's policy, or is this just Obama acting through a bunch of his former staffers who now are Joe Biden staffers? Is this just more of the Obama policy where they're trying to say if we're just friendly enough with the bad guys, they'll turn around and start acting like good guys?
So I think that this is Obama, Clinton, Biden administration all wrapped up again with some B team mixed in there. And so I don't think that President Biden has really changed or adapted his views for the better in decades. Remember, Secretary Gates once said that Joe Biden has been wrong on foreign policy essentially for 40 years. His instincts and impulses are even worse than President Obama's have been. And so some of this is him personally being risk averse and thinking that we can just talk things through with these dictators and authoritarian systems. But a lot of this is just the old quote unquote progressive national security playbook that gets friends and adversaries backwards and thinks that if the United States concedes ground and tries to downplay the danger of these countries, that things will go better for us. And again, history proves that is simply not the case.
You know what? It sounds like appeasement light. And I'll tell you what, Rebecca, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if we make this bipartisan, you go back to Nixon and Kissinger, and they said, let's open up to China. And when we treat them like a member of the world community and invite them to trade with us and do a lot of other things, why, they'll get on board. Like having your daughter marry a member of a crime family and say, but when he comes into our family, he'll learn the right way to do things and he'll get a lot better. Didn't work out with China. And then you had Obama, who ran in '08, saying, hey, I'm going to sit down with these folks in Iran and other places, and I have a different approach. And people bought that nonsense. And he said, I'll be able to sit down and negotiate with them. I'll negotiate without preconditions, and it'll all work out great. Didn't work out great. Iran's very near to nuclear weapons now. So do they have anything they can point at and say, it's worked to do it this way in this case? Because I can't think of one.
No, and there isn't. The foreign policy of this administration continues to get worse, and it feels like the United States has been on our back foot ever since the precipitous Afghanistan withdrawal, just reacting to crises after crises. And of course, as you point out, these Chinese military provocations are happening within the context of the Chinese spy balloon that traversed the United States. And then when it forced the Biden administration to be embarrassed and then cancel Anthony Blinken's trip to China, I think that's what we're now seeing with this, this Chinese spy base that's in Cuba. They don't want the American people to know about that either because it's embarrassing, and they think that they're going to be able to negotiate some deal with Xi Jinping. But I think you make a really great point that's important the American people should understand. American policy towards China, Republicans and Democrats have failed over decades because there was a misunderstanding, a wrong belief that if we just traded with countries, they wouldn't be so ideologically opposed to us. And now the Chinese Communist Party is enriched, and they're still communists. And so now we've just enriched an adversary that is threatening the American way of life and our country itself. And so we are in a very dangerous situation.
Rebecca, if you don't mind, I want to bring up Trump. Only because of this. When he came in, there were all the supposedly smart people in D.C. Well, this guy knows nothing about negotiating. Well, he knows a lot about negotiating. He knows nothing about foreign policy. And he came in and with a strong approach to things said this is the way it's going to be. If I have to drop an MOAB, a Moab, on top of a bunch of tunnels in Afghanistan, if I got to drop some cruise missiles on a place in Syria when they get out of line. And that approach seemed to work very, very well as a counterpoint to both Obama and Biden. Is that accurate to look at that way, that a strong America approached things the way it did under Trump, and things work out reasonably well? And now under Biden, I don't know if any other country really has respect for a country being run the way it's being run right now. One of our allies, let's say.
You're right. And this is another sort of myth that's happened ever since over the last couple of years during the Biden administration. President Trump, rather than, pointing a lot to his successful record on foreign policy, some of his surrogates and supporters have sort of gone the other way and saying, the United States needs to withdraw from the world. The United States needs to spend, less money doing these things to advance our military, et cetera. When in fact, you are right that actually President Trump increased spending on our military. He invested in advanced capabilities, more offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities. And he had a no-nonsense approach to countries like Russia whenever they would threaten to do things that would go against the American interests. And he was willing to use force when necessary, the Moab, taking out the Russian mercenaries in Syria, taking out Soleimani in Iraq. Of course, he was an Iranian general. So this was an administration that was engaged in the world, used force when necessary, but wasn't going around looking to topple regimes, et cetera, but had a very clear idea of where America's interests are.
Well, and since we've got about 50 Muslim-dominated countries on Earth, not necessarily Muslim majority, do you think they're impressed or what with the idea, well, we've now got a woke military, we've got transgender, we've got drag queens, we've got LGBTQ. I mean, if anything, I would almost think they'd be more disdainful of a military like that rather than say, we better watch out if these guys come after us.
Well, I think even more important than that, and I do think it is an issue that the United States needs to focus our military on lethality and being a strong and robust military, primarily because you get distracted and it's a waste of time and energy, and then you have recruitment shortfalls, retention problems, because our patriotic men and women who join the services don't want to be part of a college campus. They want to join the military and be disciplined and a part of a fighting unit. But I do think from our adversaries' perspective, you talk about Gulf countries, they want to know where the United States stands. It was very successful during the Trump administration when our country was very clear we were going to stand with Israel, get with us, and cooperate as we counter Iran, which is the biggest problem in the Middle East. That clarity provided the opportunity for Gulf countries, the UAE, even the Saudis, to work with the United States in a constructive way over shared interests. We have got to get back to having
Rebecca, I'm back. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. There are a few things I want to share with you, but first I want to get some calls because if you listen to the show on a regular basis, you know that we love naysayers. And if you disagree with my point of view, you're always welcome to call at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. So let me go to the first naysayer of the day, first naysayer of the week, and that's Joy. Hey, Joy, what do you and I disagree about today?
Well, it's the talk that what you're just talking about with the reference to wokeism in the military and how it's hurting our military. And just more general how wokeism is hurting our institutions. And if you look at the military, women are being sexually assaulted all of the time. And if you look at, this was a couple years old, but sexual minorities, so lesbians, gays, they make up about 12% of the military population, but they are.
Where'd you get that number, by the way?
Let me see. It's 38%. They said there were 38% of the sexually assaulted. You talk about
that's not of the military.
Sexualizing.
That's
you talk about.
So you're conflating a couple of numbers. But Joy, can you tell me this? What is the purpose of the U.S. military in simple terms?
Well, the purpose is to defend our country, but
right now, stop there, and let me ask you a second question. How does wokeism, whether it's allowing transgender biological men to pretend they're women or vice versa, how does that aid the defense of this country?
But what I am saying is that that's how you're defining wokeism. And so anything
well, you
that
can put all of it. I'll tell you what. I can put. What would you like to put in wokeism? I've got about a dozen things that I think fit. Transgenderism is one. Sexual preferences is another one. Racial preferences another one. Equity instead of equality. Equality is fine because the military is always run as a meritocracy. If you're good, you rise. If you're bad, you're out.
But there is still such racism, and there's still.
Can you show me where?
Sexism.
Can
if you
show
look at
me
the
where?
number of women,
Can
the
you
women
show
who
me
have been
where?
assaulted in the military.
And we know about that, and the women, the people who do that to women should be, and I believe are punished. If the women actually go to their superiors, say, I was assaulted, it's investigated, and I want to see it punished. That's a different issue. What I'm asking you is, how does...
It's not. No, it's
Why?
not a different issue because the idea of sexism and racism and these other...
Where do you see sexism in the military? Joy,
the
you
military
keep saying
academies and the military are assaulting women at a high rate, and there's still racism in the military.
Can you show me where the racism is? Because I know and have met plenty of Black and Asian and Native Americans who serve in the military, and they tell me you rise in the military if you're good. If you're not very good, you may be at some point up or out. If you don't rise from sergeant to lieutenant to captain, it's up or out. That's very much a meritocracy. Tell me where you see, let's say, a very good Black soldier who is denied advancement because of his skin or her skin color. Can you tell me where you can give me an example of that?
Well, you can look at the statistics for the women, and I was just trying to look up the statistics for racism. But I'll give you an example. My father was in the military for 28 years. He was a B-52 pilot,
but you're
and he
going to
ended
give us
his
a
career.
whole bunch of background that has nothing to do with the subject.
I'm going to give you an example. And he was the wing commander when he retired. He went to a group that was called the Dahlias, who were the officers, pilots in the Air Force. When Barack Obama was elected, he and another of his friends were at the meeting there, and everyone started booing and being completely disrespectful to Barack Obama, and it was because he was
hold on, Joy, hold on, Joy. I'm going to insist on getting a word in edgewise. When somebody is booed and they have black skin, are they being booed because of their black skin, or are they being booed because they have bad ideas? So anytime I criticize somebody with black skin, it's not the thing I'm criticizing them for. I'm only criticizing them because, see, that's a bigoted point of view, Joy. You believe that anything bad that happens to somebody who's black, and by the way, my great producer, Donovan Sargent, executive producer of the show, looked up the numbers while Joy was nattering on. About 1% sexual assaults reported by women in the military in 2021, the most recent year for which numbers are available. Let me go to Let's go to Ben. Hey, Ben, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. Not a great naysayer, but okay. Ben, what's on your mind today?
Well, Lars, first, I am in the military right now, in the United States Navy.
Thank you.
And I am so offended by what she just said. Her ignorance, her lack of research, how she is labeling us. We serve this country. We do a really good job. We're safer than the civilian population. You're more likely to be raped at a university that's woke than you are in the United States military. And I am just so appalled by what she just said. And I have to remain anonymous because
that's fine.
We don't have political views in the United States military. We defend the country so that they can have a conversation.
Yep.
But if they are not even having a conversation based upon real facts, that is all I have to say.
And by the way, Ben, can I ask you something, though? I know there are always exceptions to the rule, but in general, if you're highly competent at what you do you rise in the military?
Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
and if you're not very good, they may say, you've been in for a few years, you haven't made sergeant, or in the case of the Navy, you haven't made, say, Lieutenant JG. So you say, you know what, you're going to need to find another profession. It's up or out for the most part, isn't it?
That is true.
Okay, and I think in times where recruitment is low, they may say, well, we're going to let you stay a while longer. We may even ask you to stay a while longer because we're having a tough time getting people into the new woke military. But I've always liked, and again, I know there are historic examples where somebody was very, very good and they were discriminated against in decades gone past because they were black, because they were female, or whatever. But the bottom line is the military is very much a meritocracy in that the people in it don't want to be commanded by somebody who's not very good at what they do. You want to have people who are highly competent. And I'll tell you what, my mom and dad were in the Navy. Thank you for your service in the U.S. Navy. I appreciate it.
Thank you for saying thank you, Lars.
Take care now. Let's go to, let's go to Jesse. Hey, Jesse, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind?
Hey, I just got to rebut what that lady had to say about the sexism and racism. Between just in my immediate family, we have well over 150 years of military service between everybody. And, nobody, I have never seen sexism or racism. Now, just like the previous caller said, by gosh, if you couldn't do the job, you're out. That's where the rub is. You get people in there that, well, we're going to make accommodations for everything under the sun. But no, you just can't do that.
And by the way, you heard what she said, that if somebody booed Barack Obama, it wasn't because he was really bad at being president. It was because he was black. Oh. Well, using that as an excuse is not the way to fix racism or anything else. Thank you for the call. Back in a moment. You've got the Lars Larson Show. You can also follow us on Instagram as well. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line, as you heard, with a couple of naysayers just a little bit earlier. Vivek Ramaswamy joins me now, founder and CEO of the biopharma company known as Roivant Sciences, and, of course, Republican candidate for the 2024 Republican nomination. How are you doing, sir? It's good to have you back.
It's good to be on, Lars. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm a Trump partisan, but okay, I want to hear what you have to say, and that's why we have you on the show, and I want my audience to hear you as well. You say America First does not belong to Donald Trump, and you've said that you're going to take that further. How do you plan to do that?
Well, I plan to build on the foundation that he laid. I'm a big Trump fan, too, and all the way for the last several years I have been. But the question is, how do we take the agenda even further? Not just moving from building the wall to actually now putting the military on the southern border, which I believe we absolutely can legally and constitutionally do. That's how we end the border crisis. Not just putting Betsy DeVos on top of the Department of Education, but abolishing the Department of Education, which should have never existed in the first place. So, Lars, a big part of my agenda is Trump rolled over the log. We saw what crawled out of that administrative state. But if you're going to roll over that log, we got to bring the pesticide. And I'm coming in to actually shut it down. And I'm also one of the only candidates to say this. It is a shame. It is sad to see what is happening to President Trump at the hands of that corrupt administrative police state. In fact, I'm going to Miami tomorrow to publicly state my opposition to this politicized witch hunt in the disguise of a prosecution, I actually filed a FOIA request, a FOIA demand of the Biden administration today to reveal any contacts that Biden had or that Merrick Garland had with Jack Smith. And so I believe in standing on the side of justice. But in some ways, that's the best evidence that we have that we haven't actually solved the problem, which is what I want to go in there as an outsider to actually get done. That's why I'm in the race.
I'm talking to Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, would you mind telling my audience where they can find you on social media before I've got a few more questions for you? But where can they find you and help out your campaign if they so choose?
Sure. You can look me up on Twitter. You can, better yet, go to our website, vivek2024.com, VIVEK 2024.com. And, that's how you learn more. Join the movement. But to me, it's about taking America first to the next level.
Well, see, and one of the things I'm concerned about, I'm very glad that, 30 years ago, I took a position against what were known as SLAPP suits at the time, selective litigation against political participation. And I was glad I did. I didn't like the point of view of the people getting slapped, usually a bunch of greenies and tree huggers. But I said, this is wrong. You shouldn't shut down people's free speech. And boy, am I glad I did, because now I can look at Trump. And Trump is an example of not litigation, but actual prosecution for political purposes. Because, and I'll admit, maybe I was naive, but I thought, that'll never happen in America. It's foreign third world banana republics or places like China or Russia where you lock up your political opponents because you're so afraid of them. But now we've got a president who's doing it. And as you found, I think, a media, and especially I want to ask about your interaction with CNN, that says, yeah, we're not that interested in it. It's not that big a deal.
Well, the media has effectively become a captured news media, an arm of the state itself. If the political media has one job, it is to hold government accountable for its failures. And so now Biden says, oh, no, it was just an independent prosecution. We have mainstream media sitting by and accepting that narrative. If the same shoe fit the other foot, they'd absolutely be pressing on it. They should be pressing on it now. And it's somewhat shameful that now I am a competitor against Donald Trump in this race, yet I'm the one who actually has to ask these questions, which is why we made the demand on the Biden administration, a legal demand using the FOIA process, to actually shine spotlight on this. And yes, it would be easier for me if Donald Trump weren't in the race, but this isn't about politics. This is about standing on the side of principle. America first is what actually matters, and we have to put principles of this country first.
When you had to tell a CNN host, I think it was a young lady, hey, get to the bottom of it, you would think, when was the last time you had to tell reporters to keep on digging? There's more there. And yet today they hear, yeah, there might be a document that implicates the current president of the United States of taking a $5 million bribe when he's vice president. Not that big a deal. They were fascinated by Watergate. They love every other political scandal. And now they've got probably, at least by the dollar amounts and the connections overseas, to one of the biggest political scandals ever in American history. An American vice president taking $5 million from a foreign country for political favors. That makes Watergate look like nothing by comparison. And they're all ho-hum about it like, yeah, probably not.
It's not that they don't care. It's that they do care enough to be willfully ignorant of it. That's actually what's going on. So I wouldn't let them off the hook that easily, Lars. It's not just that they're asleep at the switch. It's that they're very much awake about what they are and aren't supposed to say to protect the ruling party. This is the worst nightmare of George Orwell, who's surely rolling over in his grave, of worst nightmare of George Washington, who's rolling over in his grave. This is not the way we're supposed to work. We have 3 branches of government, not 4, which is an administrative state, or 5, which is the state media, which is now doing the bidding of that government too.
Now, you come out of biopharma. Let me ask you about this in the FDA, because to my mind, the FDA both keeps Americans in the dark and decides we can't know things. It also retards the development of things that should be developed. I'm thinking of an Alzheimer's drug most recently. And I don't know what you do with that bureaucracy, like your solution for Department of Ed, which I'd join you in. But what do we do with the FDA, where they seem to be the worst kind of bureaucrats? They slow down the things we need to know. They stop us from getting the things we need to have. And they don't seem to be much of a help most of the rest of the time. Why do we have them?
Well, look, I've seen this firsthand. And part of the problem is the culture of that bureaucracy. They don't believe that they're bound by the law. They believe that they make up the law and they behave accordingly. So I think in that case, we need to shut it down and replace it with something skeletal built from scratch. In the Department of Education's case, when I say shut it down, it stays shut down. In the FDA's case, I don't think you can reform the culture of that agency, but you can create something new to basically minimally take its place to follow the laws, rather than what this agency does is basically just decides that, if you have certain kinds of vaccines, yes, it has to take 10 plus years and billions of dollars. But for other ones, don't worry about it. We'll shepherd it through in less than 6 months. You can't believe both these things. And by the way, not only make it safe and effective, but mandate that you use it through other arms of the government. You can't believe these things at the same time if you're operating according to principles of logic. But it's become this almost government cult that actually believes in the divinity of what they're saying because it defies reason.
And not only that, but to get the emergency use authorization, you block anybody from using anything else, because then you can say, well, there's nothing else available. I'm afraid we're going to have to force this on you. And it's a decision that I'm going to continue to oppose. Vivek, it's always great to have you on the show. Thanks very much, and thanks for having the courage to run.
Thank you, Lars. I appreciate you, and let's keep talking.
Absolutely. That's Vivek Ramaswamy, founder and CEO of the biopharma company known as Roivant Sciences, Republican candidate for the Republican nomination for president next year. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Are you part of the Great Resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com. Then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get your calls. Remember what happened when the Americans precipitously left the country of Afghanistan. Remember that there were thousands of Americans who were left behind, despite the explicit promise of Joe Biden in August of that year, his first year in office, when he said, we will not leave until all the Americans are out. Are we looking at the preparations for the same kind of thing that is happening in Taiwan? And you say, well, there's no war in Taiwan yet. Well, there was no invasion of any kind in Ukraine, and yet there were people who had a tough time getting out of there. You had Afghanistan, where Americans were left behind. And why is that? Consider this. The Messenger is reporting this. U.S. government is preparing evacuation plans for Americans living in Taiwan. According to 3 sources talking to the Messenger, planning has been underway at least 6 months. It has heated up in the last couple of months. Why? Because China has been saber rattling like crazy about Taiwan. Now, they've threatened Taiwan for decades. I'm not exaggerating when I say that it has been decades of China threatening. Why, if you elect the wrong person as president of Taiwan, something that mainland China doesn't even want to admit, that Taiwan is its own government. It is its own country. And of course, the United States goes along with that and says, well, we'll kind of pretend that they're not a real country. We won't allow them to have their own ambassador to the United States. They are not members of the WHO and other kinds of organizations. The State Department has declined any kind of request for comment. And a Pentagon spokesman says, we do not see a conflict in the Taiwan Strait as imminent or inevitable. And why is that important? Well, maybe you should believe the Pentagon. Of course, the Pentagons are the same folks who back in the summer of 2021 said, we don't see any danger that Kabul, Afghanistan, the capital city, is going to collapse quickly and become ruled by the Taliban. Only that's exactly what happened. And because it happened so quickly, and because we pulled out so very quickly, and because of the way we pulled out, they pulled the military out and then tried to get the civilians out. Doesn't it go the other way around? We decided to shut down the one air base that America had absolute control of, Bagram Air Base, and instead we're planning to evacuate people out of Kabul, about 50 miles away. And how did that work out? People hanging on to the outside of airplanes, dropping as the airplane took to the air, people getting on airplanes who are not vetted in any way, shape, or form, and literally thousands of Americans, both green card holders and citizens, left behind in Afghanistan. And now the Pentagon says, no, there's no imminent conflict or threat in Taiwan right now. Really? Well, should we believe them this time? Because I'm not sure I would. Welcome to the program. Glad to get to your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. And I want to pick up this call from Sam in Alaska because I had a caller the last hour, a young lady named Joy, who was explaining to me, she was trying to persuade me that America's military going woke is not necessarily a bad thing. And her case, now I didn't agree with her, but her case was, well, the American military is rife with sexual assault. It is rife with racism. It is rife with sexism. Let's put Sam on and see what he has to say. Hey, Sam, welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Hey, thanks, Lars. Wonderful show. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks for that.
Wanted to say this about Joy. I spent 10 years in the Navy submarine service on 3 different submarines. I had several African-American officers and senior listed over me. Never once did I ever see, hear, or experience anything of the likes of what that woman or any other person would state that exists. I do have to say this. You're right about meritocracy. I served with a lieutenant at the time in 2003 who ultimately became a 4-star admiral who was African-American.
Wow. What's that? Sam, did you fade on me?
States of America.
You said you served with an 2003, a lieutenant who rose to admiral? That's quite an accomplishment.
4-star admiral who was in command of all the strategic nuclear forces of the United States.
And he rose because he was good at his job, right?
He was outstanding at his job. He was a nuclear officer. Ultimately, I think he commanded 2 more submarines. He was a commodore over a squadron, and then just moved up in the flag ranks.
And Sam, I'd be lying if I told you that I haven't served in uniform, but I've talked to many people who have, and they all have at least one story of somebody who never should have been promoted, but they were. But those are more limited compared to the ones that you tell me, where if you're good at it, you rise because you got people under you and people above you who recognize this is the person we want, because there's a direct line of connection that when something gets screwed up, they look at the guy or gal at the top of the list and say, why was this? And he looks right down the list, and everybody takes responsibility. When you're in that kind of spot, you don't promote your friends and buddies just because they're friends and buddies if they're not good at what they do, because you'll take the blame for it if they screw up, correct?
That is correct.
Well, I appreciate your service in submarines. Was there anything else you wanted to say about Joy's phone call? Because what I wanted to get from her was this, Sam. I got her to admit that the purpose of the military is to protect and defend this country, to fight wars when we ask them to, and to defend this country. And what I want to know is, where is there any value in turning the military woke? Does that aid the cause of protecting this country? Because I don't think it does. I think it works the other direction.
I would completely agree with you. I have to tell you, I served when only men served on submarines. Yes, they put women on. I've had numerous buddies of mine that we've all, I was back in the 80s, but numerous guys have told me on and off, it's only a matter of time, and this is not to be bad against the women. It's just there is going to be a time when it's going to require on submarines in a catastrophe that it's going to require strength and things that men possess that few women do. And I'm not trying to.
No, you're not bad mouthing women. We all, God bless the differences, But my wife always says if our house ever catches fire, she wants a 6'6" tall, 250-pound guy who spends a lot of time at the gym. She does not want a 125-pound young lady trying to pick her up. Thank you very much, Sam. I appreciate it. By the way, are you a small business owner who could use a few $100,000 and who couldn't? Employee retention tax credits are an incredible opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out over 1,500 small business owners to get about $300 million in new funding. And they know what they're doing. They've got a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for those tax credits. And they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retain 5 or more W-2 employees, even if you got the PPP, you need Get My Funds. 800-535-2950. That's 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Monday. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly at 866-HEY-LARS. But it's always great when we welcome back to the program Professor Nicholas Giordano, who's a professor at Suffolk Community College and the host of his own podcast known as the PAS Report. He's also a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Education Fellowship. You know, Professor, welcome, first of all. Secondly, I saw a new poll out today that says an awful lot of Americans seem to be tilting toward conservatism and away from liberalism. And this was a mainstream poll. It was either Rasmussen or Gallup. And yet, for some reason, Gen Z has been shifting away from liberty in favor of Big Brother security. Is there a way of understanding why that's happening, especially at this time?
There is, and thanks for having me. Look, things going on at once. So the poll that you're referring to, where we're seeing more and more younger adults start move towards conservatism, is you have this split going on in Gen Z, where half of Gen Z is basically socialist, and the other half is really upset at the last 3 years where their lives were stolen from them with the lockdowns and the mask mandates and the school closures. So you have that going on, but you also have millennials that are aging. They're getting older. And as they get older, they're getting a little bit more wiser. And so they're starting to move more towards conservatism because they have bills to pay. They're paying taxes. They feel it at the grocery stores. So you have a couple of things going on. But what is concerning is that you do have 1/3 of Gen Z that has absolutely no problems putting cameras, government-mandated cameras, in people's homes. You have 54% of Gen Z that has a favorable opinion of socialism, while 43% of them have a negative view of capitalism. So those are causes for concern.
I don't understand this, though, because, and I want to emphasize this, I did mention this survey, Professor, last week, but the idea of cameras in society is already a bit controversial. I mean, putting cameras in public places. Now, I assume that when I'm in public, I don't have any expectation of privacy. But just to put a punctuation point on it, these are Gen Zers who say, oh, I don't mind if the government puts a camera inside my home.
Well, it goes to what Campus Reform has been talking about and reporting on, and the fact that people aren't being educated, young Americans are not being educated on the values and ideals of America, what the idea of liberty and freedom are, how that's the core philosophies of American politics. And they haven't been taught that. So they've been taught to obey authority. They've been taught that government is the answer, that government is the one that solves problems, that whenever something happens in society, it's not about personal responsibility, it's about government action and activism. That's what a failed education system looks like, and these are the types of students that they produce. All you had to do was listen to the graduate from CUNY that was slamming the NYPD as fascist, as the American legal system was just based in white supremacy, and her own law school promotes fascism and white supremacy. These are the types of students the universities and the colleges are producing out there.
Well, and the old adage from, I think it was Franklin, gets attributed to, where he said, if you want to trade some of your liberty in exchange for security, you'll end up with neither. But these are people who say, and the problem they want to address by, say, having cameras in your home, presumably monitored by the government or agents of actors that are acting on behalf of the government, would be to reduce domestic violence, abuse, and other legal activity. So they're literally imagining the government or somebody doing it for the government watching your activities in a home and saying, well, this couple got in a fight, and it looked like the male in the couple might have been getting ready to do something violent, or he slammed his hand down on the table. And they want the government to watch them in their homes. And it's 29%. So more than a quarter, slightly less than a third of the Gen Zers say, yeah, that'd be okay to have somebody else watching what you're doing in your personal spaces.
And I could assure you that 29% was never required to read 1984, right? I mean,
Big Brother.
Exactly. And they have no problem with it. But understand the mindset of the generation. I mean, they live their whole lives online. They live their whole lives and tell their whole life story on the internet. So to them, they look at it as this is nothing new. We should have cameras in people's homes. They don't realize that the more power you give to government, the more likely abuses are to happen. I mean, just look at the Patriot Act. Many people supported the Patriot Act after the 9/11 attacks. We were promised that it was only going to be used on surveilling foreign terrorists. And sure enough, just 7 or 8 years later, the CIA and the NSA build out the massive prison program that's collecting every single American's metadata. So,
and by the way, Professor, I'm talking to Professor Nicholas Giordano, who's a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Ed Fellowship. Use that practical example. What was all that surveillance for? Well, for foreign agents. You mean like Carter Page, the American citizen who found out that he was wiretapped by the government because he was a part of the Trump campaign? And how'd they get the warrant to do that from a FISA judge? Well, because they went to the FISA judge with a whole pile of fake data that the FBI knew was fake when they walked in with it, put it in front of the judge, and whether the judge just had no curiosity or what, the judge bought the whole bunch of malarkey, as Joe Biden would say, and handed them a warrant to surveil an American citizen.
And then it came out that they lied to the FISA court, manipulated the evidence that they presented to the FISA court. Nobody was held accountable. But this is part of the problem with young Americans in the United States today, is that they don't see how easily things could be abused, and they don't see and they don't care. That's the concerning aspect. At Campus Reform, we report constantly on free speech issues when it comes to college campuses. And you have some of these younger Generation Zers that are the most intolerant people that will not let a speaker that dissents from their views speak on a college campus, where they need free speech zones set up. So when we're examining these issues, a lot of it starts on the college campus, and then it bleeds out into the broader society. People may look at this and say, well, it's only 29% of the American people, when the reality is that 29% is going to go into business. They're going to go into government. They're going to go into public policy making. And so that's the concern. As they graduate and go into these positions of power, how do the dynamics change? Keep having the indoctrination mills. Well, what happens 20 years from now, 30 years from now? That's the concern.
No, and I've got that concern too. And I take your point, Professor, that they've lived online their entire lives. You know, they grew up with the internet and they grew up with social media. But the only thing is, social media, at least you can control. You can decide, I will take a selfie of myself when I'm not looking that great. But you can also decide not to. I don't know if they've imagined what it would be like to have a camera on you 24/7, 365, and every one of your actions and every one of your words is going to be monitored by somebody else who might agree with you or might actually say, no, I don't like what that person said. They've triggered a microaggression or some such. Professor, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks very, very much. I appreciate it. Hey, what if you could help turn back the clock and help your dog, like my dog, Sir Winston, be like a puppy again, no matter what their age is? And that's why Dr. Marty developed Nature's Blend, because your dog needs a diet full of real cuts of meat, similar to what they'd eat in the wild. Dogs go bonkers for Dr. Marty's Pets Nature's Blend. When given the choice between Nature's Blend and the giant online retailer's #1 bestseller in dry dog food, a study shows 29 out of 30 dogs choose Nature's Blend first. I got to tell you, Sir Winston Churchill, our Bernese Mountain Dog, he loves it. Tori from Tulsa says, my fur baby is so eager to eat it. Other dog foods I've tried give my sweet boy issues with allergies. As soon as we switched over to Dr. Marty's, all those issues went away. Give your dog a food they'll love and help support the youthful energy, healthy skin, easy digestion, and happy full life. For a limited time, claim 54% off Nature's Blend and receive a free pack of premium dog treats from Dr. Marty's Pets. Go to drmartypets.com. That's /pets, drmartypets.com/pets, or text pets to 511-511. That's text pets to 511-511. Study available on request. Data rates may apply. Joe, it's a pleasure to be with you on a Monday. And if you want to join what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. A little welcome to our newest Lars affiliate, and that is KIDO in Boise, Idaho. Glad to have you on board. And in Adele, Georgia, WDDQ, that's FM 92.1, where you can find great talk radio all day long, and you can find my show Monday through Friday. Our Twitter poll today, should foster parents lose their kids if they won't endorse transgender education? The example in this case, although I'm sure we'll find more, not just in Great Britain, but also in the United States, the deputy head teacher at a school in the UK reported a foster mother to the authorities and suggested her children should be taken away because the woman questioned the school's teaching of gender ideology. The official claimed that the woman, who can't be named for legal reasons, was exposing the children to exceptionally bigoted views. And I take it by that she meant the woman actually believes that a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl, and you can't pretend to be the other. She even admitted the kids were well-fed, well-presented, meaning dressed right, looked after physically, and even loved. But how are they going to grow up in terms of their views if the views they're hearing from their carer, which is the generic, I guess, non-gender term for a mother? In fact, I hear from parents all the time who say, my kids have been told there's no more Father's Day, there's no more Mother's Day because some kids don't have a mom. I think that's hogwash, and I'll tell you personally, I lost my mom when I was 10. Was I bothered from the age 10 till I left high school that other kids had moms and other kids had dads? No. I thought it was great that they had moms and dads. I understood why my mom was gone. She was killed in a car accident. A drunk driver hit us. But I didn't sit there and get upset or triggered or anything else because other kids had moms and I didn't. I mean, if you sit and cry, I guess, in your own chocolate milk every day because of that, I think my mom would be ashamed of me if she looked down from heaven and said, hey, get on with it. Honor me with the way you do. Don't honor me by, crying about this. But I think all of that point of view is crazy. And the idea that you have to indoctrinate your kids to a particular point of view about gender, and if you won't do it, that your kids should be taken away from you, is absolutely outrageous. You can find the question, which goes this way: should foster parents lose their kids if they won't endorse transgender education? I would say no. You can vote any way you like. At Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in, so I joined the group years and years ago. You can join too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. Well, tomorrow at about 12 noon on the West Coast and about 3 p.m. on the East Coast, Donald Trump is going to be arraigned on the first federal indictment ever of a former president of the United States. So, does the indictment of President Trump change your vote in 2024? In other words, you were going to vote for Donald Trump, and now you say you're going to vote for somebody else because he's been indicted on those federal charges, which, by the way, I'll dig into those in depth a bit later on. 94% of you agreed with me and said no, and 6% of you said yes, it would change their vote. Find the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show. Now, a couple of small items I want to clean up. Number one, we've told you before that Jeffrey Epstein, the previously prosecuted pervert who was up on sex charges again when he allegedly committed suicide, although many of us, including me, do not believe he committed suicide. J.P. Morgan Chase, the big bank, biggest bank in America, had Jeffrey Epstein's accounts. And a lot of folks, including me, have questioned why when they knew what he was involved in. So in other words, you're providing the banking services to somebody who is out obtaining sex from children. Why would you continue that banking relationship with any customer? J.P. Morgan Chase has now agreed to settle a lawsuit that accuses the Wall Street giant of facilitating financier Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking enterprises. David Boies, who's one of the lead attorneys for the victims and chair of the Boies Schiller Flexner firm, told NBC News the bank has agreed to pay almost $1/3 of $1 billion to settle that lawsuit. Clearly, J.P. Morgan Chase knew about things that were going on, could have taken action, decided not to, and shame on them. After years of promoting abortion around the world and spending billions of dollars on political causes, George Soros has now given his son, Alex Soros, control of the $25 billion enterprise. I guess George has decided he's not done enough damage already. And Alex, at least by all accounts, seems to be even more radical than his father. He has already visited the Biden White House 17 times in just over a year. He has met with big-name Democrats, so they know who's got the money. And 3 people, sadly, fatally shot, at least 4 more wounded at a mass shooting at a private residence in Annapolis, Maryland. That happened yesterday. And yes, I'm sure the Democrats will gladly call it some kind of gun crime. It is not a gun crime. It is not the bullets or the gun that do the damage. It is the human being who has a hold of that gun. And we're not going to solve the problem by blaming it on guns. You have to solve the problem by blaming the bad guy. Paul French writes in, but you can always send more emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Lars, Democrats have a different idea of toxic masculinity from the rest of us. To us, all these mental illnesses caused by feminizing boys is what we consider toxic masculinity. But what you must understand is that to the average Democrat voter, being a man is toxic to them. Being strong, being confident, standing for principles, building bridges and skyscrapers, building roads, throwing your trash into the back of a garbage truck all day long, working on an oil platform, pretty much any job that females either can't or won't do, that is what Democrats consider toxic. They are intimidated by men, not males, but men. Men who act like men, talk like men. Democrats hate that. They hate men who are not harmless sissies. Why? Because they want males they can control, not men who stand for what is right. Everything the Democrats do, young boys and teen boys, is either to groom them for sexploitation or to make them weak and helpless. That is because helpless males make the best kind of slaves, signed Paul French. Paul, I'd have to agree with you on that. Glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Now, one last thing about the poll I mentioned earlier. 38% of Americans now identify as very conservative or conservative, according to a brand new Gallup poll. That is the highest number in more than a decade. The percentage of Americans who say they are liberal or very liberal has dropped from 34% to 29% in just the last 2 years. As far as I'm concerned, that's great news. Hey, are you a small business owner who could use some money, a few $100,000? Employee retention tax credits, they're a great opportunity for you. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic. They've already helped out 1,500 small business owners to get about $300 million in funding, and they know what they're doing. They've got a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits, and they're with you every step of the way, even if there's an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retained 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, even if you already got the PPP money, you need to call Get My Funds now. at 800-535-2950. It's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. And no upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with Get My Funds at 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And you know, for about the next year and a half, we're going to be talking to a lot of candidates, including Donald Trump, including Vivek Ramaswamy, and including Rhonda Kennedy, who is a leading federal attorney and a candidate for the U.S. Senate. Ms. Kennedy, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So tell my audience what you're running for and why you believe you do a great job in the U.S. Senate, which seems to be, well, by a lot of our estimates, kind of a messed up body right now.
Right now, yes. Well, I mean, who else to take on Turtle Man, Mitch McConnell? But I don't take any mess, and I hold people accountable. I'm not afraid to say what needs to be said, and I'm no one's puppet. So I think being in Senate, I would actually definitely be turning things up there and holding people accountable, all members, both houses accountable, and also protecting the American people, putting the people first, which is what every member of Congress, both houses, should be doing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because the problem is we seem to have kind of a dysfunctional government. We have a Congress that's supposed to make the laws, and they've outsourced their job to the federal bureaucracy and basically told the voters, we get to stay longer if we have somebody else actually make the tough calls. And I've never understood that. People who seek power and then once they get it, want to hand it off to somebody else so they don't have to do it.
Yeah, exactly, because they don't want to be held accountable come next election. They want to be able to just blame it on somebody else and pass the buck. But, every member of Congress that was elected should be held accountable, and they should do the jobs that they were elected for, not delegate it to someone else.
So tell me this. First, tell my audience where they can find your campaign online so they know where to go to help you out, whether they live in your state or not.
It's RhondaKennedy.com. That's Rhonda with no H, Kennedy.com.
Very good. I want to ask you about the charges against Donald Trump. He shows up in court tomorrow to be arraigned on the first federal indictment ever brought against an American president. And I'm curious what an attorney like you says about the very idea that a former president is charged in a federal indictment and charged under most of the charges go back to the Espionage Act, which is, as I've read about it, is a terrible piece of law anyway that almost everybody I've read, whether it's from the right or the left, seems to agree probably violates the U.S. Constitution and is not constitutional or legal.
Yes, I agree. I don't believe it's constitutional or legal. And actually going through and reading the indictment, I was kind of appalled at how the indictment read. I mean, one of the things that was mentioned in there, I mean, if this isn't political to help Joe Biden in the presidential election, why does the indictment mention statements that President Trump made when he was running for president in 2016, and then also mention statements from 2018? What does that have to do with anything with his now alleged charges? And mostly it's on obstruction. That's what they're going for. That's the biggest issue that President Trump's going to have to overcome is the obstruction and their accusation of lying to the FBI. But the federal government, the prosecutors have a lot to overcome as well. I mean, they have to prove their case. Showing boxes, we don't know what's in those boxes.
Nope.
We don't know if there were classified documents in there because, as you know, those documents, the agency who issued those documents can declassify them. So they have to prove that they were classified and actually what was in those boxes. So the burden is going to be on them. And also what I would do if I was on Trump's legal team is I would challenge the executive orders that he's being charged under. I would do that constitutionally and challenge the executive orders, because if the executive orders turn up to be unconstitutional, then the charges would be as well.
Well, let me ask you this, Ms. Kennedy, you should know. My audience knows because I say it all the time. I'm not an attorney. You are an attorney. But I want to know how this works, because an awful lot of what he's accused of doing is hanging on to paperwork that the National Archives said should have gone back to them. And you say, okay, that's a civil violation. So it gets a little technical. It gets a little in the weeds. Can I be charged with a conspiracy, which is a criminal charge, for violating a civil law? And I've told my producers, I said, the best way I could understand this is if you and I were in a car and we were in Nevada where you're running for the U.S. Senate, and I said, hey, Rhonda, there's no parking around here. We're not going to be able to go to the event. And you said, oh, well, I know a place where we can park illegally. And I say, well, parking illegally, I might get a ticket for that. And you say, okay, so we've conspired to commit a civil violation, a parking violation.
Right.
But the penalty for conspiracy can be a long, long time in federal prison. But can you generally charge somebody with a conspiracy to commit a civil violation?
Yeah, well, it's not really the civil violation that they're going after. If you read the indictment, it's the last 6 charges: the obstruction and the conspiracy to commit obstruction to obstruct the investigation, and then also lying to the FBI is a crime in itself that you can be charged separately with.
Right.
So basically, they're just they're trying to manufacture crimes they're not really focusing on the documents. They're focusing on the alleged cover-up of having the documents, and so that's the crime, is the obstruction and the making falsified statements to the FBI, which is
well, and it almost sounds like the way they went after General Flynn, where they said, well, he lied. And you say, he didn't lie. You had a transcript of what he said to the Russian ambassador, and then you went and talked to him, and even your own people, even some questionable characters like Strzok or Page, or those folks said, no, there's nothing here. And you say, no, but he lied to us. He lied to us. And it sounds like they're trying to get him on a process crime instead of actually going after him on a real crime. Is my impression right?
Yes, exactly. You're exactly right. It's like this, and every law enforcement officer out there probably knows this. It's like charging someone with disorderly conduct, right? You don't have an underlying crime. They really didn't do anything, but disorderly conduct is the catch-all that you can get someone on for disturbing the peace or disorderly conduct, which is only as if you disturb someone's peace, you could yell and someone turns and looks at you. It's disturbing the peace. So that's exactly what they're doing. They're just trying to get him on a technicality, but they're going to have a huge hurdle because, here in America, you're innocent until proven guilty.
Yep.
They have the burden. And I can't wait. We only have the indictment, but I can't wait to see the witnesses, the affidavits from the witnesses that they were able to get the warrant in the first place. And then they have to prove that everything in those boxes was classified.
Absolutely, and that he had not declassified. That's Rhonda Kennedy, no H in Rhonda, RhondaKennedy.com. She's running for the U.S. Senate in the state of Nevada. Ms. Kennedy, it's a pleasure to have you on. Back in a moment, we'll get to your phone calls and emails at 866-HEY-LARS, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
We all talk about courage. Well, I see more courage in this lawn than I've seen in any time in the recent past.
At any time in the recent past. Now, that, of course, is stumbling Joe Biden. And this, of course, is the Lars Larson Show. I'm going to tell you how to call in just a moment. But I got to say something about what the president said this weekend. Because whether you know it or not, Joe Biden just flipped a big middle finger to everybody in the U.S. military. And he did it because he wanted to signal his virtue toward an LGBT crowd that were gathered at the White House. A White House that had been adorned by a couple of American flags on the sides of the balcony. But right there, dead center, where Old Glory is supposed to hang, Joe Biden had the rainbow flag because Joe Biden is anxious to prove that he has all the virtue he'd like to signal. Now, this is why it's insulting. He said, I see more courage on this lawn, referring to the LGBT crowd that was gathered at the White House, than I have seen at any point in the recent past. Now, why is that so significant? Because the day before he said that, Joe Biden had been speaking to hundreds and hundreds of members of the United States Army at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. And it was only a week ago that he was talking to thousands of graduates at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Now, let me ask you this. He's standing in front of a group of people and he's suggesting to them, the fact that you have announced to the world, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm transgender, I'm a man who likes to wear women's clothes and might even have some surgery done and take hormone blockers and all that stuff. That's courageous in Joe Biden's book. More than he's seen in the recent past, even though his recent past, 24 hours before he said that, was talking to people in uniform, Army soldiers, who've signed up to do service for their country. They are at the beck and call of Uncle Sam 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for literally years. They have agreed, when necessary, to be sent to foreign countries on the other side of the planet and have bad guys shoot at them. Joe Biden apparently sees the courage of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people as something he hasn't seen recently. Certainly not at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. Certainly not at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And they put up this big pride flag on the White House, and the United States flag, Old Glory, is hanging in an inferior position. This is just how desperate Joe Biden, and probably more importantly, the people who are pulling his strings, because I don't know of any serious person who actually thinks that Joe Biden is actually calling the shots at the White House. More likely, it is Barack Hussein Obama through his former staffers who now work at the White House for Joe Biden. He's actually calling the shots. Joe just shows up and they tell him, if you go out and give this speech and if you say the right things, read off the teleprompter, we'll give you a nice ice cream cone this afternoon. And by the way, I don't know if you know this about his schedule. Joe Biden had to have some dental work done today. Now, I know when you're a kid, when you go to the dentist, you say to mom, I'm seeing the dentist at 9 o'clock in the morning. Mom, is it okay if I don't go back to school today? Now, a sensible mom would say, you know what? You can go back and sit in a classroom. Going to the dentist is not an excuse to take the entire day off. But having just come back from a weekend, Joe Biden is now taking the rest of the day off. Because after all, America doesn't have any major problems they need to confront right now. Not an energy problem, not a war into which we're pouring hundreds of billions of dollars. In any case, welcome to the Lars Larson Show on a Monday. If you'd like to dial in to what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And of course, you can vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that two places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter. And if you don't like Twitter, go to my website at larslarson.com. But please, vote once, not more than that. But I want to tell you something about the crazy stuff that Joe Biden is saying. He is bending over backwards for the LGBT crowd. And the problem is, he goes at it with a whole bunch of falsehoods that he regularly and routinely tells. I mean, he tells a lot of lies about his own background, about his background as a truck driver, a coal miner, or 100 other things, or finishing at the top of his class in college. Those are the kind of lies we're used to hearing from Joe Biden. But consider this. Joe Biden this last weekend said, quote, a person can be married in the morning and thrown out of a restaurant for being gay in the afternoon. Now, is there any factual support for that at all? No, there's not. But will the mainstream media actually fact check Joe Biden? If it had been Donald Trump, you know, the guy with the orange hair, they'd fact check him all day long and twice on Sunday. But Joe Biden gets away with whoppers like that. Where in America do people get thrown out of a restaurant for being gay in the afternoon, especially in a state that honors the U.S. Supreme Court's order that all states have to honor gay marriage? He also told a story about seeing, quote, two well-dressed men kissing each other decades ago in Wilmington, Delaware, which he says he had never seen before. Even the Washington Post said that story doesn't add up. He was also said that he was proud to have ended the ban on, and I'll say it the way Joe said it, transgender Americans serving in uniform. And take a listen to this. Joe Biden, he paints America as one of the most anti-gay places in the world. Listen to the soundbite.
I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, not where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that. Nobody's violated that law. There's been no challenge to that law. Why do we need a constitutional amendment? Marriage is between a man and a woman. What's the game going on here?
Yeah, that's actually a historic soundbite with Joe Biden with his previous position on gay marriage, one that he was happy to ditch as fast as he possibly could. He also says he's got a brand new funding plan to help families support and affirm their kids and address the LGBTQ homelessness. So now they get put ahead of other Americans. The media takes this and they simply swallow it, hook, line, and sinker. He says crazy stuff like this. He says you can get thrown out of a restaurant for being gay. He says, all of these crazy things, and that the courage of people in the LGBT community is greater than the courage he's seen recently. Even though recently he's been standing in front of audiences of young men and women who've agreed to go somewhere and get shot at by the bad guys in defense of their community and maybe even have to die. But their courage somehow comes second to the courage of somebody announcing they're gay or transgender or bisexual or lesbian. If that makes sense to you, you're probably voting Democrat this year and next year. Glad to have you with me on a Monday. Always glad to take your calls. And naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find that at Lars Larson Show. Or you can go to my website. The vote counts the same at LarsLarson.com. And you can send an email to talk@LarsLarson.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I tell you all the time that I think the government doesn't exactly shoot straight when it tells the public about what's going on. But the guy who's literally written the book about what's being done to your kids, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, is the brand new book from Professor Wilfred Riley. He goes by Will, by the way. He's a professor of political science at Kentucky State University and the author of this brand new book that's coming out called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which in this environment promises to be a really hot-selling book, I would imagine. Professor, welcome to the program. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
I want to ask you about this because I was amazed when I saw the headline on a piece you wrote this week, and it was about redlining. And redlining comes up on this show from time to time in simple ways, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Black Americans have said why we were redlined. There were banks that would draw a red line around certain neighborhoods, predominantly black neighborhoods, or highly, a large percentage of black Americans, and just say we're not making any loans in those neighborhoods. And that's been used to show systemic racism in America. And you push back on that, not just a little bit, don't you?
Yeah, the usual presentation of redlining is that redlining was this thing that was done only to black Americans basically just because of racism. So the idea is that banks simply wouldn't make loans in black neighborhoods because they didn't like black people. And I actually, for a new book that you mentioned, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told You, currently available for pre-order through Amazon. But I started doing research into some of these kind of genuinely accepted or generally accepted public narratives, and I found out that a lot of them, Lars, just weren't true. So redlining was something that was done to target poor applicants for loans. So John McWhorter wrote a piece about this a couple of years ago that was very empirical, went on for a couple pages, where he found that at least in the 10 cities he was able to get all the data for and look at, 82% of the people that were redlined, that were turned down for a mortgage in a working poor area for one of like 5 reasons were white. They were Irishmen, Italian American, so on down the line. And that doesn't mean race didn't play a role. Like more than 80% of all black applicants also lived in red line areas, which was higher than the case for any white group except I think the Irish. But this wasn't just something that was done to black people. That's how the narrative has evolved over time. But it's something that was done to Irish Americans, Italians, Jews, and so on, often in the very same neighborhoods, Appalachian migrants that black Americans lived in. And the idea of the book is kind of taking on, we've all read probably in high school, Lies My Teacher Told You, which came out in, I believe, the early 1990s. Or Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, or any of these other books that argue that what you learned in school from, a theoretical, conservative, patriotic teacher is probably wrong. They didn't tell the truth about the Indians, that kind of thing. What I find is that the reality is that for most people who grew up in a city for the past 40, 50, 60 years. I mean, that we're talking about like 1975 when we use those estimates. What people have been told is actually more from the left side of the fence. And a lot of those things are even less true than what kids perhaps heard in the 1950s. So yeah, the redlining story is part of that, but there were quite a few other things that we dug up. I mean, the majority of the people accused of, espionage or working with the Russians during what's now billed as the Red Scare were Russian spies. There's a series of releases called the Venona Cables that actually break down who the spies were. So I try to give that other perspective. Are the people that are now in charge telling the truth?
And by the way, the Venona cables you point out in the piece you wrote are decrypted Kremlin messages. So in other words, this wasn't just, a really good source told us. No, these are decrypted cables that came from the Kremlin saying that folks like the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Lachlan Curry, Maurice Halpern, all these people that are cast as they were falsely accused of being spies, and that's where America was. No, you said in the majority of cases, those accused of being spies were in fact spies, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they made a movie about Dalton Trumbo. Yeah, I mean, they were all Russian agents. And that was an amazing chapter to write because as a political scientist, you almost have to be familiar with the Venona cables. And a lot of people that are what's called Americanists or Europeanists have actually worked with them. I have myself. But I obviously, when there was, no money or a contract involved, I hadn't sat down and read through all of them. But in 1995, the USA and Russia, during a period of peace, they weren't the Soviet Union anymore, decrypted the old Kremlin cables where the Ruskies contacted many of their infield espionage operatives, what we just call spies. And reading through these, if you seriously take a look at them, what the decryption revealed is that those names you skillfully mentioned there, I mean, almost everyone that was defended by the U.S. left as sort of falsely accused, you hear the term McCarthyism a lot, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, for example. I mentioned Trumbo, I mentioned Lachlan Curry, Alger Hiss inspired that classic book, Witness by Whittaker Chambers. All those people were actually agents. I mean, they have code names in the Venona cables. For anyone listening that's sort of a dad or mom, a history buff, I would Google Venona. It's Venona cables. And you can see exactly who was working with the Russians. The Red Scare wasn't some sort of unfounded attempt to target dance professors or black Americans. I mean, there actually were thousands of highly placed Russian spies in the USA. They almost destabilized the country.
By the way, I'm talking to Professor Will Riley from Kentucky State University. His new book is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. The one that kind of caught me off guard, because I've never heard this before, Professor, you said, for example, a young Emmett Till was murdered as foully as is generally assumed, but 2 of his 4 killers may have been black? I mean, when I read that, I went, hold on. I've read about Emmett Till before. Never once read that 2 of the 4 killers may have been black Americans?
Yes, may have been is National Review being polite. I mean, one of the classic mainstream journals, glad to write for them. But I mean, I think is probably more accurate. I mean, and there's a direct link in the piece you're mentioning, which is kind of a discussion of, the book Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me in National Review. But there's a link in that piece to a Chicago Tribune article that talks about this young man, this African-American businessman who's dealing with the fact that his father was almost certainly, and again, that article's a little bit polite, one of Emmett Till's murderers. Almost everyone that witnessed the tragedy that night, these men coming to get, young Mr. Till and so on, mentions that there were 3 or 4 guys and that they didn't all appear to be Caucasian. And because that doesn't really fit with the narrative, because that moves it perhaps more into the arena of husband who thought he was wronged, who was a crazy guy, kills, charismatic young guy, as versus just historical oppression, just ethnic conflict. I mean, that's been kind of moved out of what you could call canon, maybe, but that is something that happened. So yeah, I mean, there are many stories like this. The focus of the book, of course, isn't historical racism didn't exist. It clearly did. But even there, when you unpack a lot of those stories, the Tuskegee experiment, for example, was conducted almost entirely by a well-known center-left black college. That's what Tuskegee Institute is. It still exists. They play some decent football down there.
That is Professor Will Riley. Glad to be with you as well. If you want to jump into the conversation, it's 866-HEY-LARS. And I'll get to calls in the next segment at 866-439-5277. By the way, if you're buying that name brand CBD right now, write down this website, genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. Make the switch to generic CBD and save today. Save big time, up to 75%. Their products are fantastic. They sell a muscle and joint cream that's out of this world. I love it. It retails for about $100, on sale right now for $39.95. But you can try it out for free. That's right. Just pay $2.95 for shipping. This penetrating cream melts right into your muscles and joints, your knees, your elbows, and your lower back. You won't believe how fast it goes to work. Plus, it doubles as one of the best moisturizers I've ever tried, and I have tried it. You'll love it. Absolutely. And don't worry, it's not a subscription. Get your free sample at genericcbd.com. Get it headed your way right now. Get your sample at genericcbd.com. That's genericcbd.com. These products and statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or illness. And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get to your phone calls and emails. One of the institutions we watch closely, and we've been telling you the last couple of weeks about some of the bigger decisions being made by the U.S. Supreme Court. We watch the Supreme Court of the United States because their decisions are so very consequential, and they usually come about this time of the year. Mark Smith joins me now, who's a constitutional attorney, host of the Four Boxes Diner podcast, and the author of the book Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. Mark, welcome back.
Lars, good to be on.
You saw a bit of a sea change in SCOTUS, as we shorthand it, right? They kind of went to the right last year. Was that a surprise?
Well, I don't think they go to the right, Lars. I think the way to understand what's happening here is that for the last 50 years, the Supreme Court has been largely controlled by left-wing judicial activists that have taken American law in all of its forms, including constitutional law, and moved it to the left in a place that it never should have gone. So what we really are going on now is a renaissance or a restoration, as I see it, of the rule of law, a restoration of the Constitution, because the Constitution is set down in black and white in writing so we can all read it. It is supposed to be followed. It is not up to nine black-robed mystics, if you will, to be able to make stuff up. And that is where we were for quite some time. And what's going on here is, for example, the Supreme Court last term, Lars, said that the text of the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms means exactly that the people have the right to keep and bear arms. It's in the Constitution. In contrast, the alleged right to an abortion, whether it be good or bad policy, you can have that debate. But the reality is this: it's not in the Constitution, and there's nothing at the time of the founding or at any point in American history, really, up until the present, that would suggest that some sort of fundamental right on par with things that are found in the Bill of Rights. So again, I think what's happening here, Lars, is the Supreme Court is engaged in a process of restoration of the rule of law and the constitutional meaning, which is a place they never should have departed from.
See, and I agree with you about all of that. And frankly, you're going to make all the liberals listening, and I do have some of those in my audience, they're going to run around like their hair's on fire because they're going to say, you mean the Constitution is not a piece of silly putty that we can mold into whatever shape we want it to be to fit whatever need we have right now? This is going to be a shocker for a lot of those hard lefties.
Well, yeah, and here's the problem that constitutional conservatives face, Lars. To be a successful left-wing jurist, like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's extremely easy because you view as your part of your jurisprudential viewpoint, your ideological viewpoint, Lars, you consider that using the courts, which is a branch of government, don't forget, to advancing the progressive cause is actually your job. Your job is to make sure that the outcome is always good for the left and the progressives in America. That's your role as a judge. In contrast, conservatives try to follow the rule of law. And frankly, in many respects, it's a tremendous disadvantage to conservative politics to have conservative judges trying to follow the rule of law as written, because sometimes you will get a decision that is not politically good for, let's say, Republicans, but is an honest and earnest, serious application of the law and the Constitution. And that's why I've always said, Lars, that from a left-wing perspective, it's a lot easier to find good judges who are always going to rule in your favor than it is for for conservatives, because the conservatives are not trying to get to an outcome. They're trying to follow the law. And sometimes that law can lead to a policy choice that you and I might not like, but that is the law, and it has to be followed by judges.
I'm talking to Mark Smith. His latest book is called Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. But isn't the left-wing point of view, look, I'm not a lefty, I'm a conservative. Fine, I've got a bias. But their point of view is inherently un-American, I would say, because the founders of this country were tired of tyranny. So they said, we're going to have a country where the government governs with the consent of the governed. And while we're not going to whipsaw the way a true democracy would operate, we're going to be a constitutional republic where changes happen deliberately, slowly. But the people's point of view is represented by every 2 years House of Representatives, every 6 years Senate, and a president with the three bodies kind of working against each other, but, creative obstruction, if you will, saying changes will only happen when the people's representatives want them, and when you get that happy coincidence of a House, a Senate, and a president who can all get on board one idea. And this view that you just described of the judges is one where you say, no, the people don't need to have any say in what is done. It will all be done by elites. Do they recognize that that's the point of view they have, that the consent of the governed doesn't mean anything?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, that is their viewpoint. This fight about who should govern our society runs all the way back to Greco-Roman times. Remember, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, one of the things they did is they literally acquired thousands of books from around the world, and James Madison sat down and read a ton of these books, trying to understand why civilizations and societies had risen and then failed, and in terms of liberty being failed and tyrannies would arise. And Madison and the founding fathers studied all this, and they tried to create a republic with a constitution to prevent that. But the reality is there are people in our society, and there's always been people in society that think that the best way to organize a society is to let the smartest people, the elites, the bureaucrats, the subject matter experts dictate what should go wrong or what should go right or how we should govern ourselves. We see this in the context of gun rights, Lars. Think about the ATF. Now, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, don't forget explosives, they consider themselves to be the gurus when it comes to all things firearms. They think they should dictate to Americans what we should have for self-defense, what we should have for firearms, because they are the quote-unquote experts, as opposed to trusting we, the people, to decide what we think is best to protect ourselves, what we think we should have in terms of arms and firearms to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities. They want to be able to dictate to us what we get to have, as opposed to what it should be, and what the Supreme Court, thank God, has said so far under the Second Amendment is we get to dictate what we have for arms to protect ourselves. But yeah, this fight over who should govern society goes all the way back thousands of years. Some people think it should be the bureaucrats. In modern day parlance, we would refer to that, frankly, as the deep state, the intellectual giants in D.C. And then as far as I'm concerned, I believe we, the people, should govern ourselves. We have the power. And as you know, there's three essential elements to a citizen. You cannot be a citizen in a society unless you have at least three things: the right to vote, the right to private property, and of course, the right to arms.
Yeah, because if you don't have that, you could, Lincoln never worried as much about a foreign government taking us over, although we certainly had our go-around with the British. He worried about tyranny arising from within, didn't he?
Oh, yes, I think, and the founding fathers did too. In fact, I write about in my most recent book, Disarmed, specifically about a very important Supreme Court justice. He was the youngest Supreme Court justice in history. Your listeners will know him from the movie Amistad, because he was the one who wrote the decision that freed the slaves after they rebelled against the Spanish overlords on the ship in Amistad. And his name was Joseph Story. Now, he is extremely important because not only was he the early Supreme Court justice, the youngest ever, he also wrote the earliest book on constitutional understanding and constitutional commentary. He specifically refers to the right to bear arms, for example, as the palladium of our republic, the most important part of the republic, because it prevents us from being, suffering and being overthrown both internally and externally by foreign invaders and the like. And I talk extensively about how Joseph Story's wisdom at the time of the founding and what he said about the Second Amendment is a lesson that the Ukrainians, frankly, failed to learn because they did not arm themselves. And guess what? They get invaded. But you're absolutely right. Joseph Story talks about about that the dangers of tyranny are not just from foreign invasion, but can also arise domestically. And by the way, for anyone that sat through, the Katrina hurricane and were disarmed after Katrina, yet there was no civil order, well, that's a perfect example where you wake up one day and there's no civil order because of a hurricane or a riot or who knows what. You're on your own. You are your own first responder. And of course, we know the rooftop Koreans in the LA riots in the 1990s. Let us never forget them.
No, you shouldn't. And think about what's going on now, where even in some of the biggest cities, the police have been defunded, they've had their hands tied, and if citizens are going to protect themselves, they have to protect themselves and not by the cops. His book is called Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. His name is Mark Smith, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
And it's because of this that we are here today, facing an unprecedented moment where a sitting president of the United States has taken action abusing his power to direct the federal government and justice system to be used against his major political opponent in the midst of a presidential campaign, charging him with multiple crimes with an election right around the corner. This is not something that should happen in the United States of America, and it could be the final nail in the coffin of our democracy.
And the only thing I disagree with Tulsi Gabbard about, and I don't disagree with her about much, is the fact that we're a democracy. We're not. We're a constitutional republic, and there is a big, big difference. But other than that one narrow point, I agree with her. This is dangerous when you have an American president who's failing right before our eyes, Joe Biden, and he decides, because I don't care how much he denies he talks to the DOJ or Merrick Garland or anyone else, he doesn't have to talk to them. They understand what needs to be done. And we've got an American president in Joe Biden who is now suspected of being involved in a $5 million bribery scandal when he was vice president. And if you say, well, how come I haven't heard about that in the major media? Last week, the U.S. Congress finally got a hold of the document that the FBI has been holding away from Congress, telling Congress, why, you have no business asking us for that document. And what does that document say? It's one of the FBI's trusted sources who says that when Joe Biden was vice president of the United States, he received some part or all of $5 million as a bribe from a company in Ukraine that's called Burisma. Now, let me give you the rest of the details and then talk about what's going to happen when Donald John Trump walks into a federal courthouse in Florida tomorrow to answer the first indictment ever against a former president of the United States, first federal indictment to be answered by a president. He's already had state charges in New York, and we've already seen where that case appears to be going. But this gets into where they're accusing Donald Trump of espionage. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And if you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's here every single weekday at 866-HEY-LARS. And if you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line. If you think it's perfectly okay to charge Donald Trump with espionage under a very problematic law that dates back a little bit over 100 years and has been used for some things you may never have heard about, but they were news back in the day. But let me tell you what Donald Trump is up against. He's been charged with 37 different counts. I heard one news organization say 38. I believe they're wrong about that. But 31 of those 37 has to do with a law called the 1917 Espionage Act. And if you say, well, that's about spying. World War I was on at the time. And the problem is this Espionage Act has been regularly and routinely used against Americans for political purposes. Sometimes those Americans were people I would have thoroughly disagreed with back in the day. For example, a guy by the name of Eugene Debs. He was a big labor organizer, full-blown socialist. He was to the left of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if you can believe that, except Cortez wasn't around at the time. But in 1917, he was charged with violating the Espionage Act. Do you know what he did to be charged with that crime under this Espionage Act? He gave a speech in which he urged his audience to interfere with military recruitment. There was a lot of controversy about the draft even back in 1917. And then the Espionage Act was used in the early part of World War I because they went after what they called written material urging treason. Do you know what they did? They went to 74 different newspapers, which back in the day, for those of you who who've only been alive since the internet came about, these newspapers could only be distributed through the U.S. Postal Service. And these 74 newspapers were told, we don't like what you're saying in the pages of those daily dead fish wrappers, so you're not allowed to use the Postal Service to spread these lies and treason. You're going to engage in lies and treason because you used the First Amendment to the Constitution? It was literally used to silence free speech. And I'll give you another example. One of them, in 1919, about 2 years after the Espionage Act was put into place, there was a guy by the name of Charles Schenck. And what was his awful crime? I wouldn't have agreed with him at the time, but he started handing out leaflets. And what he said was, if you get drafted for the military during World War I, that violates the Constitution's 13th Amendment against involuntary servitude that at the time they passed the amendment was, for the most part, aimed at slaves, at slavery in America. He was convicted of conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act because he handed out leaflets with a point of view. Now, I didn't agree with his point of view, but should you be in America, a country with a First Amendment to the Constitution that protects your freedom of speech and freedom of the press, should you be threatened with prison and conviction of a crime for engaging in that kind of free speech? Well, what's happened now? Donald Trump has been accused of violating the Espionage Act. That is most of the charges against him. There's another problem, though, too, and that is what they're accusing Trump of is conspiracy to violate the Presidential Records Act. Well, there's a general rule. The Presidential Records Act is a civil law. It's not a criminal law. But they're engaging in an accusation of conspiracy. Now, I'm not a lawyer. You all know that. But if you say conspire to violate something that's not a criminal law, like if a friend and I said, hey, there's no parking available, we want to go to the ball game, and my friend says, I know how we can park illegally, but we won't get caught. So we conspire to park illegally. Well, parking your car illegally is not a criminal act. But the penalties for conspiracy could be 5 years or 10 years in prison. So you get charged with conspiracy to violate a civil act. That's not legal. And then you've got the fact that the very same day that the indictment came down last week against Donald Trump, Joe Biden himself is in big trouble. Now, Joe Biden has held, classified documents at home by his own admission for more than 50 or almost 50 years, 49 years. But why is Joe in trouble? Joe's in trouble because the FBI, using one of its highly credible, confidential human sources, says that when he was vice president, Joe Biden got a $5 million bribe from the Ukrainian oligarch, the billionaire who owns Burisma, the natural gas company in Ukraine. I mean, the connections to Ukraine are absolutely amazing. Now, what's the upshot for all of us? Well, when it comes to the political side of things, there's a brand new poll out that says, are Americans becoming more conservative or less conservative? Guess what? They're becoming more conservative. And all these attacks on Donald Trump, it's almost as though the Democrats said, we have to make sure that Donald Trump wins the Republican nomination and then wins the presidency. The latest poll, a CBS News poll, CBS, the network that has BS all day long and twice on Sunday, they actually say that Donald Trump now has a lead over Ron DeSantis of 38 points. Not 38%, he's 38 points ahead of DeSantis despite all these attacks. That's where we sit right now with Donald Trump heading into court tomorrow. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.